What do you think? You're halfway through your first Spring MEHA Conference. Do you have any opening impressions so far that you want to share with the group?
Yeah, it's been really good. It's big. A lot of people. Yeah. It's not intimidating at all.
Awesome. Got a chance to see a sweet video this morning.
Yeah.
That was definitely a highlight for me so far, personally.
Yeah,
what are you thinking about tonight for bags? Are you playing?
yes, Husto and I, Team Thanos.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Watch out for that snap. It's coming.
Right. So, I feel like this is the point of the time when I tell all of you who haven't yet signed up, we are having a bags tournament tonight. I am hosting said bags tournament. We do need more folks to sign up. So don't be afraid. Come find me later. We'll get you all signed up. There's plenty of slots still. But maybe we should just stop beating around the bush and get to the point.
We should probably get into it.
To the point. Cool. Well, yeah, go ahead and do it. He also goes by the name El Milagro. Very proud owner of Victor Hugo's Taqueria. It's located on the corner of East Lake Street and 4th Avenue South. Amazing dude, fun to work with, and most importantly, his food's great. If you get the chance, on the weekend only, stop in and grab some of his menudo. It's absolutely to die for. But maybe more to the point of this conversation is he was fortunate. He was invited to be a vendor recently for the NCAA Final Four tip-off tailgate event, one of 5 locals that got the chance. He was very excited. He was stoked, and he got himself planned well in advance, and it was a busy time for him. He made a lot of money, and it was he introduced a lot of new folks to his food. But it wasn't all roses for him. Going up to that event a few days ahead of time, we went out there with the sole purpose to verify his ability to cool down his bulk recipes. Almost his entire menu is, massive, big bulge, big batch, braising meats down. So a lot of examples of cook show were taking place. And we really wanted to vet that part of the procedure. It turns out that was a big fail for him, and it had some real consequences for him. We had to discard almost all of his full day of work right there on day one. That cost him a lot of money, and most importantly, it cost him a lot of time. He spent that whole evening throughout the night remaking all of that food. And it really got me thinking, as Husto and I were making our rounds back and forth from East Lake Street to go see Victor twice a day over the entire NCAA Final Four operational period, why does this happen? It doesn't really matter who the chef is. They could be a James Beard award-winning chef with 40 years of culinary experience, or it could be the first-generation immigrant who happens to own a taqueria on East Lake Street. Either way, the failure is often, it's distinct, and I think personally as inspectors, we're not doing enough to drive the needle to help guys like Victor Hugo have success. So that's kind of what got us thinking about this, to be honest with you.
Yeah, we thought about why is cooling hard, right? And one thing that came up for us was a risk factor study that we did from data from our inspections from 2014 to 2016. We looked at how often we called violations, but how often we weren't seeing them, so how often we were marking not observed. Some groups of violations we saw all the time, and we also modeled violations for pretty often. So these are things like date marking, right? You're hardly ever marking not observed. They usually have foods that are date marked. Some foods you call violations less times for, but you still see them most. You mark them in or out. Some violations you don't call so much. You also don't see them very often. This might be reheating. It's usually early in the day, whatever it is. But then there's this last category, cooling. It stood out. It's the only one in this quadrant. And actually, among all these risk factor violations, this kind of sample that you're seeing, we called it out the most. We were also seeing it hardly ever, marking not observed all the time.
Yeah, I feel like that has a lot of implications. I mean, when you kind of think about our study, we started out by saying, okay, so we're calling the time temperature violation 15% of the time. Now, if you stack on the method violation, it's actually 20% of the time we're calling cooling down the field. However, just a quick snap of our results, we saw that 57% of chefs were failing. Now I have to give that some more definition because our study wasn't about how often chefs fail. This is all about the methods. There was a lot of affirmation bias here. We got with them well in advance, had a time scheduled. They knew that we were regulators. They wanted to make us happy. They were putting their best foot forward. We also used the study to actually do some consultation with people. So we actually toggled some of these recipes. I say all this to say that that's not a true failure rate, right? If you talk about any given Sunday, that failure rate's probably closer to like 70%. And really, that's a huge disconnect between 70% and 20% of the time. We need to be calling cooling violations more often. Yeah. I think it's really just as simple as that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we haven't really gotten into why cooling is hard, though.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I kind of lean back to my times as an operator, and when it comes to managing a restaurant, cost structure is very challenging. And labor is one of those things that you can really modify on the fly. If it's a slow day or if it's been a slow week, you can call people off. I think we've all noticed that kitchens are a hectic environment where people in the back of the house are multitasking at an incredibly high rate. What that really leads itself to is when you throw on the idea of verifying a process, a complicated one that requires multiple data, like verifying cooling. I mean, imagine that. This person's on the line, they're making tickets, they say to themselves, oh yeah, I'm also watching that food in the back walk-in cooler. They get off the line, they find the thermocoupler. Where's the thermocoupler? They look for the Sandy-Way. It's nowhere near that thermocoupler, right? But they get in the walk-in, they find the food, they find ideally the warmest part of the food, and they take a data point. And then they have to consider, what did that mean with the last data point? What is my rate of change? Is it enough? Is it not enough? I think we paint this picture to kind of say, is this really a sustainable practice? Is this really something that our chefs can do reliably, consistently, again and again? And really kind of ask the questions, what would a chef do? How would they approach this problem? So like, I think as an ex-chef and still like to chef it up a little bit, you know, chefs think about things in a concrete sequential way. They have a recipe that they follow and they have steps to that recipe. If we could create step 8 in the recipe that was cool food like this, if we could make the method a standardized part of the recipe, we think that that would maybe make their life a little easier.
Yeah, I don't think chefs are thinking of cooling as a time temperature requirement. They think of it as a method, and I think that's what the shoes that we need to step into to fill that gap.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think like the second prong of Logan's well-made scatter plot is also inspecting cooling is also really hard. There's kind of a lot that goes into it, right? I mean, when you're a new inspector and even as you're a seasoned inspector, it's always easier just to call a cold holding violation. I think I was sitting at a presentation that Caleb did about a year ago talking about the top 10 violations from MDH's standpoint. And cold holding was super high on the list, and he said a lot of them are probably actually cooling. But that requires more critical thinking, more deductive reasoning, and a little bit more evidence to call that violation. And there's tons of variables that are kind of going on in that picture. So the cold holding violation is always easier to call.
Yeah, thermometer doesn't lie, right? The food's 47, not cold enough. Done.
Also, just the sheer metrics of the whole thing. Think about how often we're in the restaurant over the course of the entire calendar year. Let's say you're lucky. Let's say you do 2 routines in a year, maybe throw in a re-inspection, maybe even you stop by and chat with them one time. You're still probably not going to exceed 4 to 5 hours in that person's restaurant over the course of an entire year. And cooling is a process that takes multiple data points to verify. So your odds of actually getting the chance to see it are fairly reduced.
Yeah,
right?
There's also the idea that we just don't have a lot of experience as inspectors making tons of food and cooling it down.
So you're not making pasta and salad for 500 people Saturday night?
No, that's a Sunday night.
It's a Sunday thing for you. Okay, I didn't get an invitation, so I'm a little bit hurt.
Me too.
So there's also one other kind of elephant in the room here, right? And that's the fact that we usually rely upon our first data point on a verbal talk with the chef. Let me kind of paint you a picture, Logan. You walk into a walk-in cooler, you're eyeing up a Cambro, you see a little bit of condensation on it, it's covered, and Spidey sense goes off, and you're like, wow, that could be cooling. This is the moment. Here we go. You open up the lid, you take out the trusty thermocoupler. Boom, the food's 95 degrees. I'm sitting next to you as the person in charge. What's the first thing that you're likely to either ask of me or want from me?
When did you make this?
I don't know, not that long ago, maybe an hour ago, right? Like, I mean, I'm not saying that because I'm a liar. I mean, maybe a little bit, but I think the reality of it might just be the fact that I'm really far removed from that process if I'm the person in charge. Maybe I'm on the line X point, making sure that lunch rush is happening. Or maybe I just know the right answer to tell my inspector, right? There's a safe answer and then there's a concession answer. It's always easier to say, hey, get this guy out of my bag, it hasn't been that long, blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
That's really terrible science, though. I think that all of us in the room look for better evidence.
I mean, right in front of you in that situation is something that's not lying to you, and that's the methods. It's right in front of you. Foods are in a container, they're in some kind of unit. I think that's what we need to start relying on, rather than trying to reconstruct this idea of when the food started cooling from a chef that doesn't think of cooling as starting at 135. They don't know when that food hit 135. they know the started cooling process when it came off the heat.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a huge disconnect there in
Yeah.
time. That could be half of a day, for goodness sakes.
Yeah, we really wanted to focus on the methods and understanding those.
All right, so food code's there. Food code gives us an idea. It gives us some guidance. It's our tool in the back pocket, and the food code addresses time and temperature. It also gives us that trusty list of 6 ways that may help food cool down faster, right? But there are some limitations to that idea. There aren't critical limits. There's not thresholds. Things are not defined or spelled out.
Yeah, what is the shallow pan? When do you mix the food? When do you add ice as an ingredient? Is it really useful if the food's still boiling?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that are kind of just left for us to kind of muse about a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that the really appropriate analogy is the Google Maps analogy, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like, Google Maps is great, right? Because it gives us a couple things. It lets us know when to turn and where to turn. But could you imagine if they were to reprogram Google Maps and take away the when? It was just where to turn?
It wouldn't be that helpful.
No, I mean, you might be in International Falls right now. This is your first time north of Minneapolis.
Yeah. In fact, Kevin, I think, did make it out to...
Craigens.
You probably had a faulty Google Maps. You had a food code.
Right. Okay, so we're thinking to ourselves, more backbone, more reasoning. So we said, all right, Annex, riddle me something about cooling methods.
Yeah, these are the 2 paragraphs for cooling methods in the annex. We were hoping it would provide a little more context, maybe some measurable, quantifiable things. We'll save you the trouble of reading it. Don't bother. We annotated it a little bit. Why don't you take it through it?
Yeah, so we kind of want to reduce it to things that might be more tangible for your eye. So the first strike through mostly just says, if you cook more food, it's harder to cool it. The second strike through is a run-on sentence that duplicates itself, so it's not giving you more unique information, so we reduce that for your eyes. The third strike through, hey, you can always change your process. You know, you don't need to cool your food down. You could just heat and serve it. And the final strike through, this is my personal favorite, a good solution is just to buy a blast chiller. At the end of the day, if you're Victor Hugo, you can afford a $30,000 blast chiller, right?
Yeah, we'll leave the pitching on that one to you guys.
Yeah. Let me know how that goes.
This is what we're left with. It's about 2.5 sentences without really any quantifiable things. It doesn't tell us how deep a shallow pan is. It doesn't tell us what materials that facilitate cooling are. It's metal, by the way.
Still haven't got critical limits, right?
No, yeah, it didn't help us, and it was a little bit disappointing.
So I feel like there's kind of a lot to kind of chew on there, right? But I think hopefully the moral of the story here is that the status quo is just not working. It's failing. We're failing, they're failing, we're all failing. But I think that, bring back the graph that we showed them earlier between our study and our violations, right? There's this disconnect, but I think the goal should be to call more cooling violations while also helping chefs cool things better. Bring those bars closer together.
Yep.
So that kind of got us into our idea.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to understand what cooling methods actually work so we could do that, so we could help chefs and also help ourselves understand cooling. The first thing we did was kind of look for previous research in academia that had been done. We found some lab studies, obviously, on how fast things cool, inoculum, stuff like that. And then we did find one retail restaurant cooling study.
Actually, I think some folks in this room, if Dave Ryman's still in the room, he could definitely attest to this. He was one of the people who did this data collection back in 2013, the SNET study, which incorporated, I think, 9 states, 450 sites, and it also co-opted with Dr. Don, who also gave us the idea to do a podcast kind of like this. But he did some analysis of those results and put forward a predictive modeling for cooling. But he also concedes that one of the weaknesses of his position is that it's relying upon 2 data points, not continuous time temperature readings. Just nobody had done that yet. So we really wanted to fill in that gap. We wanted to help tell that story.
Yeah, you can imagine what might have happened between these 2 points, right? But there's a lot of things that could happen. Any number of these 3 dotted lines could have happened as well. And in fact, these are 3 real recipes that we saw during our study in Minneapolis. They all cooled in about 10 hours. They took really different paths to get there, though. And they have really different public health implications.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
That was the gap we really wanted to fill.
So I think we kind of started off with the idea, like, we're going to take data logger, continuous time temperature marks, and we're going to try and model it, chef it up a little bit, and hopefully strip it down to some bare bones ideas, maybe throw an equation together with a couple, 2, 3 variables that you could use and they could use, and we could all have this kumbaya moment, so to speak. So we set out to measure things on top of taking all this data, we wanted to also measure the methods themselves.
Yeah, I mean, first we had to kind of like design the study. We don't do this every day, so we turned to staff who work on the floor above us, the quieter floor, the research and evaluation team who do this kind of thing every day. And they were a huge help in figuring out, getting a privacy notice, a questionnaire, developing SOPs. They really emphasized training, consistency. We had about 5 inspectors that went out and collected data.
I
Maybe
think
even
most of them are
shout
actually in
out
the
to
room,
all of you.
so thank all of you who helped collect data for us. It was a huge
Yeah.
help. But I think what it really taught us is, man, we're really not scientists, so thank you for making us better at doing science. And they got us to a point where we were standardized operating procedure. We put it through the head of review board, they gave us the 2 thumbs up. We even had the pleasure of calling up Dr. Don, got him on a conference call, gave him the whole SOP, laid it out for him, and he said 2 super big thumbs up. Go for it, do it, you're on the right path.
Yeah, but we did want to measure a lot of things, so we wanted to look at a lot of different methods and how they impacted schooling. And mixed, was it covered? Did they use an ice bath? Did they use an ice wand? Were they used appropriately? Yeah, lots of stuff.
Yeah, and we also wanted to scoop up some data about the food itself. Like we were like kind of curious about the intrinsic food properties. So we also measured, is it a solid? Is it a liquid? If it's a liquid, is it chunky? Is it smooth? We even went as far as to take density measurements out in the field. So we really wanted to get an idea of how the food and the method was interacting with each other. And we also wanted to get some restaurant demographic data.
Yeah,
right?
a little cherry on top. We had a questionnaire for our operators. We asked them things like, how long have you been a person in charge anywhere? How long has this restaurant been in business? What's your volume? We asked them if they were confident in how well they cooled foods.
Let me guess, newsflash, chefs are still confident beans.
They were all very confident that they cooled foods appropriately. Yeah. We asked them if they knew the time temperature requirements for cooling. They mostly didn't. We asked them, despite their confidence, we asked them if they monitored cooling, if so, how, whether they were independent or chain, and then what kind of cuisine they served as well.
All right, so give these folks a nice snapshot of what actually collected the data.
Yeah, this is our data logger behind you. You're looking at 2 different things. The silver part is the actual like thermometer. It's waterproof, easy to clean, all the great stuff. And then it's kind of housed in this dongle, the yellow part, which has a convenient kind of tie empty end on the end. So we would tie a piece of floss, unwaxed, unscented, to the side. We could dangle it in the, yeah, I know, you guys were worried.
It was not reused, one time only.
It was one, single use.
And it really gave us flexibility to measure things like a solid, or measure things that were kind of a mixture,
Yeah.
and also measure liquids. And then as we got better at doing this, we started finding chefs who were like, oh, you want to play with the variables? I'll do that for you. So we had people who would be like, I'll give you the same scenario, right? Same fill, same recipe, same unit, and we'll toggle out a single variable. We'll do one plastic, one metal. It gave us a lot of really enriched data and allowed us to see a lot of these individual stories where we could get a chance to see where the impacts were on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, it was cool. And just a reminder, all our focus was on methods, so this didn't go against our SOP or anything. We weren't impacting the data by manipulating it, because we're not seeking to know how often cooling is failing, but what impacts cooling. So by changing the methods ourselves, it worked out just fine.
Yeah, it just gave us more data. Really.
Yeah, correct, yeah. And it's now graphs like this. This is a line, it's the real cooling curve we saw. It didn't do so well, took over 18 hours to cool. It looks like a line, but it's actually made up of many, many, many different individual data points. That data logger you saw earlier takes a temperature every 3 minutes. You can specify however often you want to take it. You can take it 1 second if you want, they'll just die really fast.
Turns out that they do have an off switch, by the way. My apologies, Dan, but we burned up like 10 of these things right away.
They're not cheap. We also want to toss something back at the operators, though, for letting us, giving us their time. This was totally voluntary. It was outside of their inspections. We told them it didn't influence their inspections at all. So we gave them kind of an analysis of their cooling methods. So we reminded them of what method they used. We analyzed whether or not they met the code requirements. And then if they didn't do so well, we told them, gave them some recommendations. Thanks, Holly, for writing.
I was going to say, and by we mean Holly.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So, lost my spot.
Yeah, we want to talk about, we were getting all this data, right? We were getting all these SPs, getting all these charts, and we kind of were just super hungry for data at the start, right?
And we were really hitting the ground running there, huh?
Yeah, what did we get to like 60 recipes, and we finally turned to each other and said, we have to kind of start to like look at them at some point.
Yeah, like this all has to mean something, right?
Right.
How do we actually compare them against each other? What is going to be our metric for a result?
Right.
I think we came out of the gate saying, Well, it's going to be the FDA food code, right? I mean, we'll just say if they made it or not. Simple as
Right.
that.
Obvious, right?
But I think that the longer we thought about that and the more truncated the data kind of got, we were like, maybe that's not, as Vince said, the why, right? So we kind of started thinking about what's the why behind cooling. What it comes down to is it's a spore former, right? It's an actual public health risk. It's probably like Clostridium perfringens, for example. So we asked ourselves, okay, this is a pretty commonly held indicator species for spore formers. What's its growth range? Well, lo and behold, it's pretty widely accepted to be 122 through 59 degrees. So we thought, thinking to ourselves, well, this would be a good way to think about success is how long is the recipe going through the Clostridium growth range?
Yeah.
That should give us an idea of public health impacts.
Right, exactly. But we had to kind of have something to compare it against, right? I mean, it'd be one thing to know that it spent 3 hours in the growth range. What does that all mean?
Still no common denominator.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So we sought to create out of nothing kind of a model minimum required curve.
Right.
Now we know the food code gives us 2 points that we have to meet: 135 and 41, 0 and 6 hours.
So we relied upon people who are smarter than us. It turns out that Newton's law of cooling is already a useful resource when it comes to things like this. I can kind of trim it down to you, but there's basically a K value. And once you have that K value, you know the slope. And you can solve for K with just a couple things. 2 data points as well as the ambient air temperature. And it turns out that 37 degrees is a pretty commonly accepted driving force to get food to 41 degrees. So when you use that 37 degrees with those 2 time temperature points, it spits you out a slope. And you can put that slope back through your curve and it will create you a curve.
Yeah. Next was, okay, great. We have this curve that these recipes should be meeting. How long does it spend in that growth range? From 122 to 59, the Clostridium growth range. It turns out it spends about 2.5 hours. So now we had it. We had our language that all our recipes were going to speak. Did they take more or less time than 2.5 hours? And if so, like how much, right? How well did they do in that growth range? So we kind of hit that special day.
Yeah. Speaking of that special day,
Yeah.
really, this was kind of the motivating feature right here, right? Is that we started to see data like this, which was super interesting because they're kind of doing a lot of things here, but based upon when you see it, you might be approaching the situation through a wide variety of ways.
Yeah, just a reminder here, the dark line is that required curve that we just came up with, and the lighter blue line is a recipe that we saw out in the field. So after 2 hours, we just expect it to be at 70 degrees. This recipe was at 51.6.
Gold star, awesome.
High fives.
See
All
you later,
around.
bye. You're
Awesome.
awesome at cooling.
Yeah. Moving on though, right, we saw this recipe took a different turn. After 6 hours, when it should be a 41, it was a 47. Different story. We're having a different
Planning
discussion.
to throw this away? Is this going to be a discard situation? Or is this just a cold holding violation? What's going on here?
Right, exactly. This recipe took 13 hours to cool, but really notably, it only spent an hour in that growth range that we just talked about, that high risk range. This kind of like drove home the point for us that to move away from that code discussion and more towards what are the real public health implications for these recipes and the methods that influence them.
It gave us a lot of confidence. And I think one more way to think about this, really from one of my favorite analogies, is if the FDA cooling curve was a car that is going 100 miles an hour, this recipe would have been a car going 250 miles an hour. I mean, this is a really great example of what you want your chefs to do. They crash that danger zone so quickly. I think that we'd all love to see this in our restaurants all the time.
Yeah. In an ideal world, we would have seen all the cooling curve, right? But that didn't always happen.
No?
No. Yeah. It's tough out there.
Imagine that.
Yeah. Sometimes, the chef might pull the dongle out early. Sometimes we came back the next day, the food was still at 50 degrees, but we had to go, so we pulled it out. Sometimes we didn't get there fast enough. Chef didn't text us in time or something.
Right.
Yeah, and then sometimes both those things happen. Either way, we had to find out a way to, we put a lot of time, put a lot of money, put a lot of effort into getting these recipes. We really wanted to use the ones even if we didn't quite have the whole high-risk range, right?
Yeah, it was a pretty labor-intensive project, and it still is. We're still collecting the data, but we go this far to say we had to find a way to scale data sets data that was incomplete.
Yeah.
So walk them through.
Yeah, we have this another good day where we kind of hit this breakthrough moment. We found a way to scale these recipes appropriately with like some logic behind it, not just like a guess.
We have so many good ideas.
Yeah, we do. So we figured out that range from 122 to 59 If you plot a linear trend line against that part of the food code, it's actually pretty linear. Has an R-squared value of 0.97. So we kind of said, okay, great, that part of it is not so much logarithmic as it is linear. We can just use a kind of a one-to-one scaling to get those tails if we miss them.
That's it.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
All right, so like I mentioned, we are still doing this, right? We're up to about 150, 160. I'm sure we have more coming in next week as well. We have some overarching goals. We do want to get north of 200, but we also want to build a little bit of a social network, a potential data repository where people could grab our SOP, formalize themselves on it, and then contribute more recipes to a centralized location. So we could really enrich the conversation. Because it turns out that there's tons of variables, and to toggle them one at a time, which we hope to do through a regression calculation, is going to require a much deeper data set.
Yeah, we want to crowdsource this thing, so talk to me.
But we figure you probably want to hear a little bit about what we learned, so we are going to give you some early learning lessons and some quick result takeaways.
Yeah.
Start us off, man.
Let's do it. So these three circles behind us here make up all our recipes when they're combined. We group them into three different groups. And that FDA required curve does 2.5 hours in that growth range. The medium, middlemost group spends 2.5 to 5 hours.
Can somebody in this room find us a word that actually means middlemost? There's got to be a better word.
There's got to be a word.
Come find me, Blake.
The medium-most thing doesn't exist. Okay, I'm calling it. Is the highest risk, right, relative to our data set. It spends 5 hours or more in that high-risk zone. A big chunk of our recipe is almost 25%.
I mean, and again, I think it's good to reiterate the fact that this still has the affirmation bias. It still has all those reasons why this is not really all the way honest. But even in this situation, that means that 1/4 of all recipes are spending double the time in the Clostridium growth range. It's a pretty substantial public health situation.
Right. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is depth. And let me preface this by saying that we discluded ice-swans from this group. It's still the vast majority of our data. The reason we did it is because ice-swans directly confound depth. They're inherently used with deep containers, right? So we took them out of this. This is still 80+% of our recipes. So we grouped the recipes into depth ranges. So 1 to 1.5, 1.5 to 2, and then you'll see those same three groups, the highest, medium, most, and lowest risk that we saw in the previous slide. We want to point your attention to kind of that line, exactly at 2.5 inches, where you start to fail more than you succeed. I mean, you're kind of playing with fire past 2.5 inches.
It's a pretty good fire. That's like 70% of the time it's failing.
Yeah, it's actually really significant and really surprising to all of us. I can say personally that I kind of felt like our office agreed upon depth, which is not defined in the food code, is maybe 3-4 inches is appropriate, but we're saying that at 4 inches it's absolutely failing, most likely.
And at 3, there's still a good chance that you're going to be failing.
Yeah, a bit. It hit home for us pretty strongly.
Yeah.
The next one is how does plastic versus metal impact the rate of cooling? We don't need to spend much time here. Plastic sucks. Our recipes using plastic spent on average 5 hours in that high risk zone. Compared to metal at 2.8, it's kind of a moot point, right? There's no reason to use plastic when you're cooling down foods unless you're using significant interventions like an ice swan.
I mean, I've gone as far as to, in my inspections now, if I see a Lexon in a walk-in cooler being used to cool, that's a technique violation.
Yeah, the photo we saw earlier comparing metal and plastic, both very shallow. The plastic one did not make it. I think it took like 12 hours.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So we do want to make sure we give the other, give that one and that ice bath a little bit of a talking point as well. So we'll kind of begin with ice baths, right? So we saw ice baths being used 27% of the time, roughly 1 out of every 4. Ironically, those that use an ice bath spent on average 4.5 hours in that high risk zone. Conversely, those that didn't use an ice bath actually only spent 3.3 hours in average in that growth range. I'm not quite sure what that's telling me. Maybe it's that the ice bath's kind of like a crutch, and it really isn't enough to get the work done. What about the wands?
Yeah, wands. We saw 22% of our recipes using ice wands, and kind of it's the opposite story of the ice baths. Those recipes spent 2.9 hours in that high risk zone, whereas the ones that did not use an ice wand spent 3.9. So pretty significant.
Yeah. So I guess the next thing that we started thinking about is that a lot of folks have put a lot of effort into ambient air when it comes to thinking about cooling. I mean, Newton did it, and Dr. Don did it in his predictive equation.
It was like his one.
That was kind of like the variable that was held in such high regard. So we wanted to ask ourselves, what is air doing? How is it really driving the bus, or is it just kind of along for the ride? So you're going to see in the bottom here just a bunch of temperature brackets, I guess you'd say. Everything from a good working walk-in freezer up to a poorly working walk-in cooler or a reach-in cooler. You can see everything from -10 to 40 degrees behind you. But the startling thing to us is that when you look at this and you put a trend line through it, or try to put a trend line through it from a linear standpoint, there's not a lot of correlation here. The R squared value is a meager 0.011, which is really telling me that if I'm out on inspection, I only have so much capital with my operator to maybe influence them. And if I'm talking about cooling, perhaps I'm weighing the idea of hopping on eBay and finding three to five more shallow pans than I am talking about refrigeration. I'm going to leverage that idea that shallow pans are so much more impactful.
Yeah.
Is that it for results?
That's it.
Man, we should have more results.
We're gonna.
So I think that a lot of the big takeaways for us while we were doing this whole study is way more about the interactions and about building the relationships and getting a chance to know chefs. Also, a lot about breaking down our misconceptions as inspectors. My again, Musto? What is that neighborhood?
Oh, the one?
Kenwood? Anyways.
It's a neighborhood in Minneapolis.
This guy was super nice. He was like, I make soup all the time. I'll make you 3 soups one day, and I'll make them all cool different ways. We have what we thought was a shallow pan, what we thought was not a shallow pan, and then an ice wand for each of the 3 soups. We had 9 recipes right here to look at. We rigged them up, we got in the car, and I asked Justo, man, you think they're going to make it? And both of us were like, it's a walk-in freezer. Of course they're going to make it. Why would they miss, right?
Yep.
It turns out that we were a little off the mark. Behind me is a scatter plot of all the recipes that we have seen so far. And that line that you see is that 2.5 hours. So everything north of that line is going longer than the FDA curve allows for the Clostridium growth range. The ones that are dark colored are the 9 recipes that were in that walk-in freezer. 7 out of the 9 failed. 78% of the time, Justo and I are miscalling cooling violations in the field. That's a pretty gut-wrenching takeaway, but it was a little bit of a humble pie for us. I don't necessarily think that it's our job to come up here and tell you that there's a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, I mean, not every solution is going to work for every restaurant, right? It would be easy to say, okay, cool, across the board, 2-inch metal hotel pans, don't care about the ambient air temperature, done, walk away. But that's not realistic, right? Every place is different. Some are smaller, some have different challenges. I think that the point we want to make more is that the more you move away from using a method like that, the more you're going to have significant interventions to mitigate for that. I mean, pretty soon you're going to be looking for big boy ice wands like this one on eBay. Good thing, free shipping, $46, not a bad deal.
It's available right now.
Yeah, you can do it.
So, yeah, I mean, that's it. It also kind of just plays back to this idea of the unintended benefits, about building those professional relationships with people who we regulate. We got a chance to spend so much time in people's businesses, learning about them, learning about their story, learning about their business and how they perceive complex situations like this. Just great relationship building. And that was the thing that I really enjoyed out of the whole experience. Actually, a week after the Final Four, Justo and I found ourselves over on East Lake Street. And lo and behold, we stopped in to see Victor, had an amazing lunch. And I don't think I've ever had many operators who have been so happy to see me. The smile on his face, he just wanted to show me something, I knew it. And he let us enjoy our lunch, and when we were finished, he came out, gave me a little bro hug, and he's like, come with me, let me show you something. Went in his walk-in cooler, and he showed me a solution that he put into place that was sustainable. He was so happy, he knew that he could do it, and it was now his new normal. And those are the kind of moments that when I walked away, I was like, this is why we do our job. This is awesome. That was a really touching moment from the miracle, El Milagro. We really want to keep the conversation going. We really have a lot of thanks to say to all of our data collectors, people who help us out in our office, and also all of our operators out there who let us come in their restaurant and take data from them. Quick little plug, come see us in Nebraska. We're going to be speaking on a similar evolved version of this conversation, and we hope to find ourselves in New York next summer as well.
Do you guys have any questions? Let's keep it going.